Welcome everyone to our fourth annual Political Concepts Conference in New York. My name is Ann Stoller, for those of you who don't know me. Hi Bruce, I see you. You're supposed to be up here. The reason that we're asking the participants to be up here is because when we began this venture 4 or 5 years ago, it was really only us around the table. And it was a conversation, and an intense conversation, and it keeps expanding every year to sort of have more concentric circles around that table. But the idea of the Political Concepts, both journal and this conference, is exchange, right? These are not definitive papers that can be have to go into press as they are, but a moment for us to think about what a political concept is and what it's not. But before I begin all of this, one of our founding editorial members, and I will go through who they all are, Jay Bernstein, wanted to say something in honor and homage to Ernesto Leclau, who we've just lost a few days ago.
I just, Ernesto and I arrived at Essex at about the same moment. So he and I were colleagues and friends for over 35 years. And we were part of that remarkable Essex Althusser reading group. And then it moved to London, and for more Saturday mornings than I can remember, there was the Marxism and Hegemony reading group in London. Ernesto really is the model of someone who worked on political concepts, that his work on ideology, on populism, on hegemony is really a model of the kind of thing we do, and his brilliance was what really began the revival of some notion of Marxist political philosophy in the UK at a very bad moment. He was difficult, brilliant, but with 2 glasses of wine, as stunningly incisive and thoughtful as any political theorist I have ever met. It became obvious to Ernesto and I after a year or two that he on Althusser and Gramsci and me arguing still to go back to Lukács, that we would not agree on anything. As a consequence, I think, out of solidarity, out of irony, out of friendship, and out of melancholy, we always greeted one another as comrade. Hello, Comrade Leclau. Ah, Comrade Bernstein. We have lost a really dear comrade, and I mourn him deeply.
Thank you, Jay. I got an email from Etienne Balibert, who's also one of the members of our editorial committee for political concepts, and he said, I hope someone will say something about the loss of Ernesto. And I said, well, how about you, Etienne? And then we get the presence of you, and we get the presence of Ernesto as well. And he sent me this beautiful statement that so confirms what Jay just said. He writes, this is Etienne. I am not writing a eulogy. I am sharing some thoughts about a friend with other friends. Ernesto Leclau has just passed away in a completely unexpected manner. In the midst of his typical activities, traveling, speaking, teaching, And we have to painfully realize that any plan to meet and exchange ideas with him, any prospect of carrying further a suspended conversation, will now have to be canceled. There would have been so much more to say and to discover, though. What I want to say here on behalf of many, I am sure, is that Ernesto was much more than the important philosopher, political theorist, and public intellectual who is going now to be recorded in histories. He was a radiant comrade, an absolutely generous friend and mentor, a spontaneous internationalist who, among other things, could sing all the repertoire of great songs in several languages. I don't exactly remember when we first actually met. In any case, that was long ago after I had read him, but before he invited me to the research center he had created at Essex, where generations of students from every nationality learned how to observe and interpret the changing world. Can you imagine that? A cosmopolitan learning community directed by a radical Argentinian in the heart of conservative England in the aftermath of the conflict over the Malvinas Falklands. That was it. Many of us benefited from that hospitality and shared the excitement of working there. It's not much longer. As for his considerable work in theory, which, as you know, ranges from the invention of an original paradigm of discourse analysis combining deconstruction and structuralism in the field of ideologies, to an epistemological break in the definition of populism, which is now largely understood after him as a generic discursive operation which construct peoples as historical agents. What I want to add is the following. I look at Ernesto's bibliography and I realize that the book that made him famous in 1985, Hegemony and Socialist Strategy, written in collaboration with Chantal Mouffe, his lifelong partner, retains a special place. It's revolutionary in its content, but also in its conception. There are Ernesto's works and there are Chantal's works. They are not incompatible, but they don't stay the same. Then there is a third author, Leclerc et Mouffe, who is completely singular, uniting them on equal standing in thought and friendship, thus perfectly illustrating what Spinoza would call a piece of eternity. That is good to think about while we intensely remember Ernesto's energy and share Chantal's terrible loss. Etienne Balibar. So with that note, some of you have been at the political concepts conferences before. Some of you have not. Some of you may not know this project, not its originary moment, so much as what it's endeavoring to do. And I thought it might be useful to just read, once again, please forgive me, a very short statement from the editorial board, because this is what the interlocutors that we've invited are being challenged by and are being addressed, are having addressed. Political Concepts, a Critical Lexicon, is a multidisciplinary web-based journal now, and it is going to be in print next year, as well as remain web, to be a forum for engaged scholarship. Each lexical entry will focus on a single concept with the express intention of resituating it in the field of political discourse by addressing what has remained unquestioned or unthought in the concept. Each entry will serve as a short defining essay for a concept. Through their argumentative strategies and employment of the concept in question, entries will aim to reconfigure a concept rather than take for granted the generally accepted definitions of that concept or the conclusions that follow from them. Political Concepts as a journal does not predetermine what does or does not count as a political concept. Our aim, this is of the whole collective, is to expand the scope of what demands political accounting. And for this reason, we welcome essays that fashion new political concepts or demonstrate how concepts deserve to be taken as politically significant. It's our view that politics refers to the multiplicity of forces, structures, problems, and orientations that shape our collective life. Politics enters the frame whenever our lives together are staked and wherever collective action could make a difference to the outcome. As no discipline, possesses a hegemony over this critical space, we welcome submissions from all fields of study. I'm not going to read the rest of it now since we've taken up quite a bit of time. But I did want to thank various people who have, and institutions. This has been a large extended consortium project. We have funds from the New School, from Columbia, from NYU, and most recently from Brown. And our editorial board at the moment consists of some people who are not here, but they've been so actively a part of this that I really want to just mention the names of everyone who has been in this venture. Ariel Azoulay, who can't be with us, Adi Ophir, Jay Bernstein, Akil Bilgrami, Stasis Gregorias, Jacques Lesra, Bonnie Honig, who's not here as well, Etienne Balibert, who's not here now, but will be hopefully in our December meeting, Andreas Calivas, Michael Steinberg, am I right? Yes. Michael, I'm sorry, Michael, your last name. Achille Membe, who we haven't had with us yet. Cam McDonald, who made this, our graduate student who made this whole conference possible. He just did absolutely all the work. And one of the most important people of all, Todd Kesselman, who is the managing editor. Todd, where are you? Of the Political Concepts Journal, has gotten all of the images and has put together the journal with the help of several other people doing the copy editing. So we begin. As this year, our format, which is, it has been and may change in the future, is a half-hour presentation and a half hour of open discussion. Everybody is invited to that discussion, even though we're sitting around this table as those people who are giving papers. We really look forward to students participating. I see so many of you here, and we'll make sure to make lots of room for you. So we begin.
So let's begin. It is part of the tradition of the Political Concepts Conference not to have big introductions.
Right.
We don't need them. So the first speaker is Gayatri Spivak, University Professor at Columbia University and the co-founder member of the Institute for Comparative Literature and Societies, many books, a lot of great influence, and she will present today on the lexical entry development. The next speaker is Hepin Yanam, Professor and Director of Graduate Field in Theatre Studies and the Graduate Faculty in the field of Eastern Asian Literature and Comparative Literature at Cornell University. And she will have her own lexical entry on New Democracy. So let's begin, Gayatri.
Thanks, Andreas. Do I need the mic? Everybody can hear my voice, right?
Yeah.
I had wanted to begin with a personal word about Ernesto Laclau, and I will actually utter that word. I met him in the 80s. I'm a somewhat angular person, and at the same time intellectually insecure. Ernesto immediately located this and gave me so much intellectual support and recognition at a time when it was hard to come by, that he really, and this is a personal remark, his loss is a deep personal loss. He continued this solidarity, which was just amazing. We had a great deal of exchange, and I want to mention an ironic and silly thing. When Buffalo had the temerity to ask for a recommendation letter for Ernesto Laclau, I had the deep privilege and honor of writing that letter. I wear it like a crown, and I wanted to mention it today as a thing to laugh at as we are mourning this great friend. Development. I begin obviously with the OED, it's a lexical entry, yes? A gradual unfolding, a bringing into fuller view, a fuller disclosure or working out of the details of anything. In other words, blooming. In India, the government uses the word vikash, this for development, which is, and in the European word, this is actually a Gaelic Celtic origin, but nonetheless, that's what it is. As a plan, a scheme, the plot of a novel. And then, of course, the definition, I'm not reading the whole thing, that we are probably more concerned with. It says, the OED says, quasi-concrete, that in which the fuller unfolding is embodied or realized, the economic advancement of a region or people, especially one currently underdeveloped. And it gives 3 quotes. One of them, Lord Milner says, 1902, what South Africa needs above all is the primary plant of civilized development. The next one quoted, 1945, economic development has benefited large sections of the people in Anatolia. 1982, all African countries, I mean, look at the
Really?
quotes, this is the dictionary, lack sufficient managerial, administrative and technical skills to undertake the massive task of development contemplated at independence. End of quote. Why is development a political concept? The historical answer might well be that we should plot it on a chain of displacements beginning perhaps with perfectibility, stopping on and with the Kant who is supposed to have inaugurated modernity by binding free will, rewriting fatalism by a rearrangement of the desire for philosophy, which desired the danger of the entire mistake of philosophizing, declaring free will by determined necessity in practical reason, leaving fatalism unguarded in the longue durée of history. That counterintuitive mark of the modern largely misfired. What took its place was the race-class determined binary opposition of free will and fatalism that runs our world today, with the so-called abstract workings of capital running a deconstruction, which is called development by way of alibi. Sorry, only 30 minutes, I'll unpack this in the writing. Ranaji Guha has allowed us to plot development in a chain of displacements applying to India, and since that's my place of citizenship and origin, I thought I would give that as an example. And I have noted this recently in the following way. I quote myself, the converted Buddhist Emperor Ashoka's new imperial universal notion of Dhamma, not to be found in the classic Arthashastra, was in its turn miscast back into Dharma, Sanskrit, both instruments of class reconciliation between sovereign and subject. Historical change, class accommodation, not psychological essence of the non-West. Just Dhamma, Dharma, improvement, civilizing mission and general theory, today development, allowing invented tradition to work at reconciling established class caste convictions in the lowest social strata. I believe one could find corresponding chains, linkings, what in French would be called enchaînement, in other parts of the world. In the last century, Michel Foucault taught us to think about politics as a heterogeneous insertion into the play of power. In my estimation, the diversity involved in the field of application of development takes Foucault's injunction beyond its limits. One can come to this conclusion by attending to questions Foucault himself famously posed about conceptualization, and I quote the English translation. Conceptualization should not be founded on a theory of the object, and we are talking about concepts. The conceptualized object is not the single criterion of a good conceptualization. We have to know the historical conditions which motivate our conceptualization. We need a historical awareness of our present circumstance. The second thing to check, says Foucault, is the type of reality with which we are dealing. End of quote. I think in our reality, if you will excuse the word, wherein states have been usually undermined, with reference to globality, some of us might think of politics by going back to the word politeia, or very roughly constitutionality, very roughly. Although most new nations are tremendously interested in new constitutions, And European nations are also concerned about constitutions because of the precariousness of the Eurozone as a collection of debtor and creditor states. In fact, we know that the charge of the state has today been taken out elsewhere. The human rights lobby, the various United Nations organizations from peacekeeping to language protection, and the international civil society in general. On this agreement, it is in general economic growth that we get a clue to what is called development, which we are about to conceptualize. The site of economic growth, however, is still the state. And there is also an increasing, if you look at the measurements of development, and there is also an increasing awareness across the political spectrum, this is nothing new, that economic growth is not a good gauge for development, more in the qualitative affective sense. This is where defining the concept begins to acknowledge those Foucauldian limits. Marx's use of the word social shared the same problem, a quantified definition that seemed useful and a fuzzy qualitative idea that cannot be satisfactorily thought through and will finally destroy the conceptual field. It is because this muddle between affect and statistics cannot be satisfactorily noted that we can have moralistic descriptive books but no discussion of solutions. Put another way, quote, development is insertion into the circuit of capital without developing the subject of its ethical or even appropriate social use. The development, so there you have the statistics and the what I'm calling here loosely affect. The development of the subject is apparently in the self-interest of the underdeveloped, but the larger pattern is the interest of developed capital, as will be clear from a sample of a sustainable development syllabus from my own university. Module 1, I quote, Introduction to Sustainability, joke, Jay, melancholy thing. I teach that. Introduction to Sustainability Management, Module 1, Management, Knowledge Management. I could go on. I'm on the terrible Council on Values of the World Economic Forum. That's what I should have defined. Introduction to Sustainability Management. What is it? How can we achieve it? Module 2, the public policy and regulatory framework of sustainability. How can this speed transition to sustainability? Module 3, a sustainably built environment. How can we plan for, design, and operate green workplaces? And in my written thing, I will give you green capital city in Chhattisgarh, which is also the place of what Arundhati Roy describes with typical left rational choices, Maoism. And then a sustainably built environment. How can we plan for, design, and operate green workplaces, buildings, and infrastructure? Finally, Module 4, sustainable financing and investment. How can we find sustainability initiatives? Fund sustainability initiatives. End of quote. This is designed for the subject of developed capital, whose force is larger than personal goodwill. I do not doubt the personal goodwill of these people. Designed for the subject of developed capital. And the underdeveloped, hastily trained into self-interest or self-interested income production, is incapable of capital management, especially globally. Therefore, if we credit the abstract power of largely more and more unregulated capital, what is ultimately sustained is minimum, quote, development and maximum, quote, accumulation and surplus for financialization. Let us call this sustainable underdevelopment. In a popular essay on development, a successful transformation of the gendered subject, which is very important and on which we should dwell in longer and more extended discussions, gender as alibi, of the gendered subject in Peru is described as follows, and I quote, and this is a typical entry, between 200,000 and 300,000 persons have been sterilized in the course of the program, 90% of whom were women. There's a 90% statistic also at the beginning of giving women microcredit. They paid back debts, that kind of a thing. That was the beginning. Right now, today it has been rewritten for affect and the Nobel Prize. Between 200,000 and 300,000 persons have been sterilized in the course of the program, 90% of whom were women. The government thus managed to restructure the field of action predominantly of its female population in the area of reproduction in a way that led to the desired change in behavior, subject formation, change in subject formation, desired change in behavior, not through the direct use of force, but through positive reinforcement and disciplinary measures, incentives offered for compliance, and sanctions used against dissident conduct, end of quote, otherwise known as carrot and stick. Gendering, also the subject of microcredit, is always the extreme example of the inefficient production of the subject of development. At the developed end, the management of subject production in the citizen, as well as the global citizen, an oxymoron, is guided by timid invocations of behaviorist economics, assuming a pre-critical theory of the subject that takes a step or two beyond rational choice, only to fall back within. Hence the absence of solutions, broadly noted, reviewing Jean Drèze and Amartya Sen's An Uncertain Glory, India and Its Contradictions, Jyoti Thottam writes, and I quote, Drèze and Sen might have devoted more thought to how to make India's existing social welfare initiatives work better. They describe successes in a few forward-thinking states, but it is not clear how to replicate those results on a national scale. The section on discrimination against girls, an issue on which Sen is an unquestioned expert, writes Thottam, also cries out for a more prescriptive analysis. That place is broken into these two kinds of subjects. And Robert Schiller makes the same complaint in the pages of the same newspaper. I quote, in his monumental new book, Capital in the 21st Century, Thomas Piketty of the Paris School of Economics documents a sharp increase in such inequality over the last 25 years, not only in the United States, but also in Canada, Britain, Australia, New Zealand, China, India, Indonesia, and South Africa, with people with the highest incomes far outstripping the rest of society. I'm just coming back from Ghana and Nigeria. We should have included Sub-Saharan here. The book is impressive in its wealth, writes Robert Schiller. The book is impressive in its wealth of information, but it is short on solutions. This is always the mark. The Human Development Index, devised by Mahbub-ul Haq and used by the United Nations since 1990, has also fallen upon bad days, as I have pointed out on various occasions since the last report of the Human Development Index, The Rise of the South, came out. The two items which transformed mere development into human development, education, life expectancy, were about to be discarded by the statisticians who put together the HDI because they want to try for more efficient statistical production. The last paragraph of the 2013 report. Thus, indirectly, we get a critique of the sentimental obstreperousness of affect measurement by statistics, although to prove my point was not the statistician's goal, of course, it's an unintended consequence. Development, with the affective paleonymy of the word, invariably taken seriously by top and bottom alike, cannot be conceptualized without theories of democratic subject formation that require alternative disciplinary formations. We must now confront the fact that development might top the list of a generic change in global index making. So the demands of conceptualization are different. This is why I quoted Foucault. Development might top the list of a generic change in global index making since the tremendous advance in statisticalization brought in by the silicon chip. The measuring of affect by numbers as it affects our everyday. Please like this, quote unquote. Please be my friend, quote unquote. These are obvious and banal points, but they affect our everyday. Presidents blog and Twitter. Development is on the cusp of this loosening of the conceptualization of the political. When such measurement began in the aftermath of the Great Depression and World War II, the idea was, as Yeats put it, measurement began our might. That's loosened, that's what I'm trying to say, because measurement is too easy. Crowd control is democracy. Measurement began our might. After Bretton Woods, I quote, GDP becomes the standard tool for sizing up a country's economy. Now, as we notice in the module for sustainable development training that I read, we must consider investment, for finance capital is infinitely more important than industrial capital or trade. And the bull market is constantly dependent upon affect. Not even the most mathematical textbooks can escape the fact that the bull market is dependent upon investor confidence. It is therefore dependent upon an interested subject production. This is what splits that charge of conceptualizing. The relationship between affect and its statistical legislation can also be seen as a displacement of the concept metaphor argument made in Derrida's white mythology long ago, that the concept erases within itself the fabulous scene that persistently produces it. Derrida, unlike Ricoeur and others, does not see this erasure as sequential, but as happening every time, like it's originary, like engaging the clutch if you're driving a stick shift car, as I do. You have to have that originary movement, otherwise the car won't go. That's the kind of thing that he's describing, the concept erasing within itself the fabulous scene that persistently produces its statistics and affect. Although worldwide policy on many angles is made on these existentially impoverished statistics, the word, quote, development, as I keep insisting in even this brief intervention, is used and felt by people who are even at the bottom of the pie to describe the general condition of human value. It is this that the concept erases. For whom is the definition to be made? What is my charge, in other words? The way in which the policymakers use it, the way in which from within the policymakers there is today a group that think development is not in the human sense development, the efforts at nuancing the concept by myriad items, by, among others, my brilliant colleague Joseph Stiglitz, is an example of Kant's long ago indication that mere reason reduces responsibility to Zurechnungsfähigkeit, sorry Andreas, or reckoning. That's the kind of nuancing that's being done, adding and adding and adding and adding things. That's not responsibility, it's reckoning. I think the desire to measure happiness is another one. It denies the possibility of subalternity, because the problem with the real subaltern is that they think objective wretchedness is normal and find happiness within it. I should know, I have long experience of working with and for them, 30 years now. Or should the definition accommodate the way in which large sections of the population use it at present as what Raymond Williams would call a residual, hanging on from the sense of being a second-class culture that came with colonialism? And again, I say, I'm coming from Ghana and Nigeria. I know what I'm talking about. The second-class culture that came with colonialism. If you think I am beginning to suggest that this is a word which would be better off without strict conceptualizing, you're correct. The task is to translate the word into many different languages and see how it is understood and internalized by the class that cannot access worldwide quantification, and by gender singled out as an alibi for intervention. Two different tasks. This is a different approach to the phenomenon of development from establishing a concept, because we already have one, a trivial one. The economic transition into the circuit of capital with insufficient attention to subject formation. That's what I've been talking about. That's the concept. Development as a concept is understood by ordinary people differently from the statistical understanding available to competitive national governments and international finance. Again, I go back to my first language. The word in my first language is unnoyon. As a noun, it works fine. It is understood as various good things like schools, bridges, hospitals, trees coming our way but never coming. For, quote, developing, there is no colloquial word. For underdeveloped, a word routinely chosen for self-description, we have onunnoto. Paradoxically, this adjective is usually applied by my clients, landless and ill-educated, often illiterate men, to describe India, as indeed it is, from irony to seriousness, used to describe Ghana and Nigeria, of which they have a somewhat vague idea. These people, not Ghana and Nigeria, but India, the huge country, the one, my clients have a very vague idea of what India is. To represent themselves, they use the colloquial version of this adjective, pichiye pora, held back, which is also routinely used by so-called radical intellectuals to describe them. Many years ago, we read Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. Now I'm going to make a suggestion about reconceptualization. Benevolent or malevolent or in between, or indeed not bothered to be violent, pre-colonial power groups unevenly enriching themselves today at the expense of the post-colonial groups inheriting older hierarchies shares this logic of deliberate underdevelopment. Not as good as today's one, but this logic, this is in the longue durée, the sustainable underdevelopment. But the World Bank wins over the moneylenders because today it's done better. This gives us a pre-modern clue to the word underdevelopment as it spreads to varieties of class apartheid present in all politics, cutting across gender apartheid and group apartheid, where the usual overflowing of something like class in the everyday must be allowed to contaminate the disinfected house of scientific socialism. I have so often cited Ambedkar's graduate seminar paper at Columbia, intended for a non-Indian audience, where he suggests that the difference in the treatment of surplus men and surplus women present in all societies is the motor of group formation as such, including caste, that I will not quote it here. I will simply refer to the fact that it acknowledges reproductive heteronormativity as the matrix within which the history of apartheid as generic rather than beginning with colonialism is held. If we allow the concept of development to overflow then, and this is a point that I would emphasize more if there were more time, if we allow the concept of development to overflow the interplay of capital and colony, we will see this matricial role more clearly. This requires allowing reproductive heteronormativity itself to overflow the outlines of sexual reproduction and be thought of as the possible unacknowledgeable antonym of the autonormativity, that is the authoritative self-representation of ideology as idea. Again, for unpacking this turgid sentence in the longer essay. Take me on trust for the moment and allow that the trivial Euro-sequential truism, time moves from the pre-modern to modern through colonialism into globality, spiced up now by, quote, culture as invented by anthropology and now bowdlerized by UNESCO and the Nara document of 1994, that runs the world, can be revised, giving us the agency of complicity, being folded together, the pre-colonial and the colonial, rather than development beginning at colonization, the Euro-sequential story. Giving us the agency of complicity in conceptualizing development as freedom in capitalism without the task of subject formation. This is the existing concept. With colonialism came unevenly the social productivity of capital and the inbuilt mechanism for the disavowal of the imbricated increased subalternization. I am asking for an acknowledgement of development as a task, understood from the subject formation rather than the capitalization angle, diversely neglected also in pre-colonial time and space worldwide. It is not, quote, individualistic to teach elite and subaltern proletarian to think in a complicit rather than this room. You know, that's of course question, why do we need to conceptualize this? Where are we? Diversely neglected, it is not individualistic to teach elite and subaltern proletarian to think in a complicit and gendered manner that development is not necessarily tied to that Euro-sequential truism that interested underdevelopment rather than development has forever made the world turn, that it inhabits the persistent structures of contemporary globality, that rogue capitalization, as it is now indicated by more and more people at the center, I gave 2 examples, journalistic, could inhabit those structures not only as rupture, but also as repetition. Once again then, I'm asking us to allow the concept of development to overflow the interplay of capital and colony. This makes, as I said, this makes room for an acknowledgement of complicity, folded togetherness, rather than see, quote, development to be conceptualized as good or evil or both after colonialism. I am asking for us to see that development as sustainable underdevelopment has a longer history, and perhaps even that this history is beginning to make itself visible as the patterns of globalization explode economic growth into developing inequality. I am suggesting that the conceptualization of development must be unevenly interdisciplinary, because the time of quantifying and qualifying social sciences and imaginative activism as in the humanities, they're not isotemporal. Unevenly interdisciplinary, statistics and political science folded together, complicit with the disciplines of subject formation, the humanities. Globalization requires a change in ourselves as instruments of knowing. Those wonderful historical approaches, culture wars approaches, critique of Eurocentrism approaches, the modernity tradition approaches, post-colonial approaches will not serve if you are doing the contemporary as such. That's the epistemological challenge. How do we construct our objects of knowledge now, in the moving, global, now time, Jetztzeit? Kant diagnoses, but cannot solve our challenge, for its maxims, by signaling, I quote, as for cosmopolitan right, I can't pass over it here in silence, he says. For its maxims, and you know what maxims, this crowd knows what maxims mean for Kant, for its maxims are easy to formulate and assess on account of its analogy with the law of nations. Smart guy. And ultimately, he breaks it off forever, Aussetzen. He breaks it off as transcendental. The unfolding of the qualities or capacities of a musical phrase, I now come to, I'm about to close, I now come to another definition given in the OET. The unfolding of the qualities or capacities of a musical phrase or subject by modifications of melody, harmony, tonality, rhythm, etc., especially in a composition of elaborate form as a sonata, and of course I add, or a raga, the development. Because it is absolutely more correct in the raga than it is, the sonata. Okay, so this is it. To conceptualize development, the intellectual must be in tune with, this is why I quoted this, enter the Bestimmung, in other words, if you take that Stimme inside, enter the Bestimmung of, quote, the people, from top to bottom, that's a World Bank word, by the way, people, from top to bottom, elite to subaltern, capitalist to client, and rearrange desires, our own among them. This supplementation is so slow and painstaking, the world has such a wealth of languages, that it is impossible for this to be a general agenda, such as the globalization of capital or social must be. This is why, once again, this kind of linguistic commitment must work as an unceasing supplementation of the work of the qualitative social sciences, which must in turn supplement the quantifying work of sociology and economics, continuing on to the development indices. Statistics are necessary. One cannot be a technophobe. That's idiotic. This is, practically speaking, as I said above, this is because development might be a word which would be better off without strict conceptualization. With the inauguration of this new genre today, where the affective part is socially mediatized, social media, we might rather engage in an admittedly, rather than disguised as correcting other people's mistakes, an admittedly persistent effort at the questioning of conceptualizations in this stage of capital. Concepts of development are needed here and now as methodological, practical necessities. If you travel, as I do, with R&D circuits and global development networks, they are needed as methodological, practical necessities, not as governing ideas. In the area of development, if you stick to classical academic concept production, you remain with the fiscal and the juridico-legal, tax reform and enforcement, and of course the sentimental statisticalization of affect, oh, it's not really development, etc. Rather should we recognize that development is in complicity with what it endangers. That, I quote, the opposition of intuition, the concept, and consciousness at this point no longer has any pertinence, end of quote. Resist the will to conceptualize, in other words, I'm saying to you as to myself, as we develop ourselves. Thank you.